But did you know that man's body is actually very similar and almost identical to the Earth's elements? Not in proportions, of course, but the elements that are in the soil are in man. And the types of minerals always coexist inside of humans based on needs. There isn't a mineral or a vitamin that's of no use to the human body. And when we look in the secular literature, we find really cool statements like the physical basis of life is pure arrangement of atoms and molecules, the same materials found in the earth. Oh, look at this secular comment. Another good one. Science tells us that the matter of which we are made came from the earth and ultimately from the stars. Scripture says God formed Adam from the dust and the ground. Both are correct. Atheists say we are made of stardust. They're actually confirming biblical creation by saying that. I find that ironic. So when they say, well, what's the mechanism behind this? Well, we can say it's very similar to like divine nanotechnology, how we do things today. So it's very, very similar process. Everyone says God used magic. Well, actually, God hates magic. So how can he use magic? It makes no sense. So did man actually live for 1,000 years? Because the Bible clearly depicts Adam living almost 1,000 years, and Noah himself lived longer than even Adam did. But after that, there's a drop off dramatically in lifespan from 600 all the way down to 175 by Abraham. So a study was actually done by the Journal of Creation by Dr. Robert Carter and John Sanford and a couple other people, where they ran a simulation, and they did it off of a peer-reviewed study by Kong et al. Now, the interesting thing about this study is they found that the older a man gets when he has a child, the more mutations he passes on. So if you're 20, you might pass on around 40 mutations. But if you wait till you're 40, you're going to pass on about 80. So the child has a higher risk of getting diseases. That's why they always say it's better when you're younger to have children. Well, the main reason why is because of mutations. So now imagine if Noah was 500 years old when he had his sons. What would we see from that? A dramatic decline in health and lifespan. And that's exactly what we see. But here's the thing. If you were creating a religion, would you create one that has people living for 1,000 years if you want people to believe you? Probably not. That sounds kind of ridiculous. But yet around the world, we find myths supposedly from cultures that never met one another where people lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. That makes no logical sense at all. So what is the genetic theory of aging? Well, your genes and the mutations in those genes are responsible for how long you're going to live. Then we're going to see that there is a doctor by the name of Aubrey de Grey, who was one of the first people to notice that the human potential of the genome is about upwards of 1,000 years. Very interesting. He's a world famous gerontologist, and he travels the world and lectures. Matter of fact, you can even get a Life Extension magazine and buy supplements. And his supplement, it's not even his company. They just hired him because he's so good at this. And he's formulated supplements for the company. And the upper limit for humans was about 1,000 years genetically, if you just remove mutations. Isn't that ironic? Multiple books have been written on this from separate people. Here's a professor of biogerontology that wrote an article and said, yeah, humans have an upper limit of about 1,000 years old. Humans may soon be able to live for 1,000 years old. Ooh, how is that possible? Is it true? We want to live for 1,000? Be careful what you wish for. It's right around the corner. Again, we're going to go back to that state, and you'll see that in a minute. He states, this professor states, he thinks that humans could live for about 1,000 years. And why? How is this achievable? It is achievable. But as you're going to see, we're going to have to do something that's going to send us back to the state of Adam and Eve. How? By a mechanism called CRISPR-Cas9. It's a gene editing software where we can clip out parts of the genome and remove segments that are causing disease. Let's say, for example, we find a mutation that causes autism. We can go in one day and chip that out and remove it. So when your child is born, they no longer have autism. Well, the same thing happens when we gene edit sequences in mice. For example, they found a gene and just turned on a single gene. It lived 23% longer. And they said that this could extend into human beings. Look at this. A small modification of your genome, you can go from 2 years to 100 years of life. This is all in the secular literature. This has nothing to do with creation. So if we remove mutations and it adds lifespan, when we're removing mutations, what sequences are we mimicking to achieve longer life? None other than Eve's sequence. We're going back to Adam and Eve. So remember, evolution tells us mutations are building up over time and we're living longer. Oh, really? Are we? Is the genetic potential really there, or are people living shorter or longer lives now than they were 1,000 years ago because how hard life was and birth defects and all these other problems? Lifespan itself hasn't increased. Genetically, it's only increased because we've learned medicine and we've implemented things to help people extend their life by, being in hospitals and genetically helping them live a little bit longer. But no, the lifespan itself has actually been decreasing over time. And that's what we're seeing in these really amazing genetic studies. So yeah, you'd be real rich. Become an investor, invest in crypto, right? We're super rich after 1,000 years. So this is interesting because we actually know Eve's consensus sequence. It's published in the peer-reviewed literature by Dr. Robert Carter himself, a young Earth creationist, and it's published. So we know what that sequence looks like. So when we remove mutations, we're going back to Eve and we're living longer. Boom. Interesting, right? And you can read about Eve's consensus sequence either in the peer-reviewed literature, or you can go to ICR and read about it right there. So is there evidence that Adam and Eve could live 1,000 years genetically? Absolutely. And it's still inside of us today. So isn't that interesting that the maximum human lifespan estimated by different scientists that perfectly lands on the biblical timeline? What are the odds of that? What's the statistical probability? I mean, why not live for maybe just 200 years? I mean, why even live longer at all? Evolution says we've been going up. We've been living longer in the past, and we live shorter in the past. We're finding the exact opposite to be true. So if these experts are wrong, if you're a critic of this, why are they wrong? How are they wrong? We would love to know. So basically, the goal of this section was just to show you that there is genetic evidence that people did live as long as they say they did in Scripture. And now you have evidence to back up that claim. We can also go to the physical evidence, but next I want to drop into genealogies and just stream right from that. So if you have any questions, let me know though. So next we need to know, what does the Bible tell us about the time frame? Different genealogies from the Greek Septuagint to the Masoretic text has a range of about 6,000 years to 7,656, with a global flood around 4,369 years to 5,329. So those are the time frames we're looking for when we look at human history and genealogies and mutation rates. And let's see if anything actually lines up with these. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at genealogies, because genealogies exist in different populations around the world, and populations that have never met one another, and they have unbroken chains, by the way. The one of them, which is one of my favorite, is in the Lambeth Palace Library, and dated to, it was 1171 AD. So it's a very old genealogies, and today it's in the British Museum. And this is a patriarch list of English British royalty that goes today from Queen Elizabeth all the way back to Noah and Adam and Eve. And it's an unbroken chain. It's 52 feet long. And look at this chart. It goes right back to, of course, the names are a little bit different, but you can see Japheth on there, and Shem, it's spelled a little bit different. Of course, it was, in a different dialect entirely. But interesting, we have an unbroken chain that we know today. We can follow the genealogies back to Queen Elizabeth II, going all the way back to that list that I showed you. And that list takes us all the way back to Noah. And then, of course, once you get to Noah, it's only 10 generations till you land on Adam and Eve. Well, people go, well, what about Africa? Because Africa is where the cradle of civilization. It's the original home of people. Clearly, it must have a genealogy that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. It actually doesn't. And the cool part about it is the oldest genealogies we find in Ethiopia go back to Queen of Sheba, mentioned in Scripture. So they also have an unbroken chain of genealogies, and their descendants, their unbroken chain of royalty, also goes back to the biblical ancestry. But then we can go to Ethiopia. They also have an Ethiopian genealogy that goes right back to Noah himself as well, in an unbroken chain. But then we go to the secular literature, because of course, biblical claims can be made by people, especially if they want to claim royalty and say, we're the best. Look, we go all the way back to Adam. Why they would want to say that is beyond me. I mean, they don't even believe it. So I don't know why they want to make the claim to begin with, other than saying we're royalty. But let's go to the secular literature and see if it actually agrees with this. This one is called Modeling the Most Recent Common Ancestry of All Living Humans. We read down here that, in particular, the most recent common ancestor of all present-day humans lived just a few thousand years ago in all of these models. They ran multiple mathematical models, and they couldn't figure it out. And, interesting, the most recent common ancestor nearly always was found in Asia. Why not Africa? So the math doesn't line up with evolution at all. It lands on the biblical timeline, and it doesn't even point to Africa for the most recent common ancestor. And it gets more interesting. We land on what's called a genealogical paradox. Basically, this paradox is based on population growth rates and interconnectedness. And if you go back just a few thousand years, everyone that's alive has the same common ancestor, meaning we are all related to one person. And as you'll see, it's the biblical ancestor. Now, everyone talks about flood myths. And flood myths, as you know, are around the world from supposedly different groups of people. They always have about 8 people that are saved. And they go, and the critics go, well, who cares? Because local floods happen all the time. That's probably what they were talking about. Uh-oh. Did they also create a Tower of Babel legend myth too? Why would they do that? Because guess what? Everywhere you find the same myth for the flood, you're finding a Tower of Babel myth where the languages were confused. What, did they all invent that too? Uh-oh. Pretty stupid if you ask me. And then here's another problem. They took the same math with them as well, because when they built pyramids, they used the meter, and pyramids exist around the world with cultures that supposedly never met, and yet they all used the same math to build the pyramids. Uh-oh. How did that happen? Now we have population growth rates. It just so happens that lines up perfectly from 8 people just around 5,000 years ago. But in the secular literature, yet again, population growth rates also match mutation rates. The formation of harmful mutations. Remember, Noah would have had his children when he was 500, and they would have inherited new harmful mutations that would have never existed. And those new mutations are called SNVs, single nucleotide variances. And magically, these arose just around 5,000 years ago in the human population, right when we began to spread out. Oh, what is the chances of that? So, Dr. John Sanford, he is a geneticist who invented the gene gun. He has over 100 published peer-reviewed studies. He's a geneticist. Matter of fact, a lot of people in Africa can thank him for their life because he invented the gene gun, which was able to produce the first ever genetically modified crops, which were actually healthy at the time, and allowed crops to grow in desert regions that had never been grown before. And the National Institute of Health, the NIH, the largest health organization on earth, uses his simulation called Mendel's Accountant. It's on their website right here. And they use it to track mutations and cancer through the population. So the question would be, if evolution is true, why don't they use an evolutionary simulation? Why are they using the young Earth creation simulation to track mutations? It's because ours work. Theirs is garbage. That's why. So next, we have DNA preservation. Interesting that the DNA seems to only last around 4,000 years before it becomes so degraded you really can't test it anymore, with an upper bound of around 5,000. Some say even more once it gets frozen. But then we're approaching the point where it just turns into myth, because guess what? We find dinosaur 125 million year old DNA preserved when it only has an upper bound limit of a couple thousand years unless something was frozen. So riddle me that one. And then we're going to now jump into looking at all of these amazing things that just so happen to arise at exactly the same time. We have astronomy, only goes back around 5,000 years. Then we have mathematics. That magically arises again about 5,000 years ago with people that never met as well. Then we go to medicine. Oh, look at that. The oldest medicine, again, is around 5,000 years old. We go to one of the oldest books on medicine, 2,400 BC. Shocker. Then we go to metallurgy. Oh, around 5,000 years ago, they just randomly decided, you know what, let's invent math and astronomy and medicine. And you know what, let's make some metal things while we're at it too. How about beer? Let's just invent that too while we're at it. Since we're being so productive this year, let's just throw in some alcohol. That'll really set us back a little bit. We're being too advanced here real quick. All at the same time too, by the way. How about irrigation? Oh, that's right. That goes back only 5,000 years as well. How about writing systems? Oh, look at that. Just about 5,000 years ago, they all just decided to invent their own writing systems out of nowhere. How about the world's oldest leather? Oh, look at that. It's about 5,000 years ago. What a shocker. How about the oldest leather shoes? I can't seem to drag this one into my file. Maybe it's too many little tabs open right here. Hold on, let me close a few and see if that's the problem. It was the problem. I've never opened up 500 before. So the oldest leather shoes on earth are found in Armenia. They go back right down here. Oh, look at that, about 5,000 years ago. What are the odds? Now somebody might Google this and go, wait a minute, I found older shoes. Look at this one. They're called the Fort Rock sandals. They're between 10,000 and 9,000 years old. Ah, but they're preserved underneath of a layer of volcanic ash. What does that mean? Guess what? You can't have a volcanic activity or a fire and have an item not be contaminated. If it's contaminated, it'll never give you the same results. And so it's pretty obvious why they dated old. You can't trust the date. Look, here's one that spread out a volcanic eruption between 36 CE and 530 AD. That's a 500-year just being wrong. They couldn't even guess when it went off. So back to this. So if humans walked around, so this is what they want you to believe, right? Humans walked around barefoot for 200 to 300,000 years until they left Africa. Once they got past that horrendous desert, they're like, you know what would have been really good is if we had shoes. That would have been really helpful. I know. Let's make some of those today. It's just so dumb. And then what do we get? We get the oldest pyramids. How old do those go back? Oh, look at that. About 4,500 years is the oldest pyramid in the world. Interesting. How about so what makes more sense? Humans were once united in one area. They had the same knowledge. They had the same math. And then all of a sudden their languages were confused. They took their knowledge, went around the world and started building pyramids. And then they used the same math to build those pyramids. I mean, it seems pretty logical, seems pretty common sense to me. How about Stonehenge? Oh, look at that, 3000 BC. Oh, there's that magical number again. How about civilizations worldwide? Oh, look, the Chinese civilization, 5,000 years old. Rare DNA proves a window of 5,000 years old. How about China? You can go down the list of different cultures and civilizations that arose. The span of all recorded history is only 5,000 years old. It's literally shows up everywhere. And this is a known paradox. So just over 5,000 years ago, mankind had no math, no documentation, no irrigation, no large populations, no religion, no sophisticated symbolism, no writing systems, no historical evidence left behind. Then, in a dramatic and electrifying change described by scientists as the greatest riddle in human history, all of these skills and qualities that we value the most in highly society appeared already fully formed as though bestowed on us by a hidden power. They wrote in this book right here, the abrupt emergence of human culture over a stunningly short period continues to be one of the greatest enigmas in human evolution. They can't figure this out. Why? Because it's not an enigma at all. It's only an enigma and a paradox if you believe in human evolution. You would have to say that humans were dumb and ignorant for hundreds of thousands of years, and then they left Africa, went into a little fertile crescent area, and then magically, they just, in this small group, just all of a sudden blossomed, and they went around the world, and then they created all these things at the same time when they were no longer talking to one another. Makes no sense. But then we don't have to just talk about humans. We can go over to deltas. The oldest deltas, when we look in the rivers, they're all young. Why don't we have Grand Canyons everywhere if they're supposedly hundreds of millions of years old? River deltas are only about 5,000 years old. What a shocker. How about trees? Trees don't die from old age. They can live forever. But yet the oldest trees only go up to about 5,000 years old. Why is that? How about the oldest desert in the world? Oh, guess what? That's only about 4,000 years old. From desertification. It's when wind blows sand over living plants that they can no longer get sunlight and breathe, and then they die, and the desert grows and grows and grows. Then we have helium and argon diffusion rates. A helium which diffuses from crystals like zircons, and they dissipate and go into the air until there is none left. Why is there so much in a crystal? It can't hold on to it forever. These crystals are supposedly billions of years old, but yet they have helium in them that can only last thousands. And then what else do we have? The oldest, these are our islands that are made out of coral and clay. So they tested how old these items are. And guess what? They're mostly around 5,000 years old. What a surprise. The oldest coral on Earth. How about other organisms that don't die? That's right. We have black coral that are the oldest living organisms or marine life on Earth. And when you go down to see how old they are, they're about 4,000 years old. Here's one, 4,270 years old. They can count the bands on them like it can count trees to see how old they are. They don't die from age. They're under 5,000 years old too. How about, so here's the another coral islands, about 6,000 years old again. So again, we have to use Occam's razor here. We have to use basic logic and say the simplest explanation is usually the best one. So what is this? This is a very easy paradox to solve, guys. This isn't brain wizardry here. There hasn't been millions of years. Very basic. what we're looking at is we see evidence everywhere, from population growth rates to how fast animal mutation rates were, which we didn't cover, to population bottlenecks, to the oldest living trees, the oldest living animals. Everything goes back just about 5,000 years. So here's the question. All of this parsimonious evidence precludes evolution theory and literally confirms the biblical timeline. And now it's going to get interesting. If you thought that was interesting, that was nothing compared to what I'm going to show you next. Example, if a child is a feral child and it's raised by animals, or it's neglected by a parent in a home, if they don't hear language from a human, they can never learn it after the age of puberty. So it's a linguistic cutoff. So obviously God had to teach Adam language for there to be language. So what we're going to get into now is, what is there proof of as far as language goes? Because remember, the Bible tells us that God took a single language and tore it into about 70 different pieces, called the Table of Nations. The evolution teaches us that man grunted language into existence, most likely. It's called the Bow Wow theory. There's 7, but that's the most popular. They copied animal sounds. And what happened is they evolved language slowly over time from a single area, and it spread probably from Africa into all other humans. Let's see exactly what the evidence says on this. To do that, we're going to have to go to Ethnologue. Now, in 2024, they updated their system. This is an encyclopedia of all of the most ancient languages in the world. And now with AI, they're able to conglomerate all languages together and determine how many are there and how many were there. And can they go back to a single language? And so they updated in 2024 with their new AI system. And guess what they found? In 2024, they listed that there's 143 language families total. Many of these are called language isolates, meaning they have no relatives. None. They didn't come from another one, and they don't link to anything else. The estimated number of isolates, meaning languages that are completely alone, are 70 to 90. What does that remind you of? The Table of Nations in Scripture says that there were 70 nations that descended from Noah's child. This is, again, the secular literature. This has nothing to do with young earth creation or biblical creation or anything. So the birth of language formed at the area exactly where the Tower of Babel was and spread from there. And when you ask AI, are there any new language families arising today? It says very small, possibly zero, in the strictest sense that there have been any new languages after that time. But why? If they're just arising easily, why not a new language family? What is the probability? I ran that as well. It's 0.0001% chance that the probability of 90 to 100 languages arising on their own worldwide at the same time from independently. It's basically statistically improbable. So then the specialist in linguistics decided, I want to find out if there wasn't an original language. I want to go back to what man originally had as a language. They couldn't find any. There is no compelling evidence for a single origin of all human languages. Here's a quote. We have no empirical basis to argue that there was ever a single original human language. They can't trace it back to one. Why? Because God broke it into 70. There isn't one to trace back to, but there would be if evolution was true. No philosopher could examine all languages together without perceiving their immense differences, which cannot be derived from a single source. No known method can reliably trace back all languages back to a single proto-language. The claims for a single mother tongue are speculative and unsupported. And here's one of the best linguists in the world, Eric Murat-Ruin. He said, we have no evidence to claim a single original tongue. These are the best linguists on earth, by the way. And what do we have? Again, we have a falsification that language evolved slowly over time, and nothing coming out of Africa as that. So we have flood myths that are preserved in almost every tradition of man. Going back to 1895, this person tracked them all down, and he said it's very strange. We have flood myths that start in a region, and then they expand outward from that location. And that would be, have you ever played the game Telephone? That's why the boats look a little bit different. Some of them don't work at all. Some of them are square and would kill everything. Some of them brought fish with them. You know, the stories get more ridiculous as you leave. But then we have the Tower of Babel myth that also spreads out from that region. And for those of you that might want to be like, I want more of this, just go to my website called creationistclothing.com. Go to my articles, and there's free books. Click on the one that says The Quest for Noah. I cover every one of these stories about the Tower of Babel myth, because I left out the flood myths because plenty of books out there exist for you to find on that. But the Tower of Babel myths are the most amazing ones. And there's one that's just outright the most fascinating of all. It comes from Korea. There was a couple men that were from America that were taken prisoner, and they were kept in like South Korea that was ever cut off from Christianity. And they had a Tower of Babel myth that was identical to the Bible story. So, then we have agriculture coming from this same region of the world, but yet Africa, for some reason, never had it. We have the Fertile Crescent where it expanded and grew out. And then in Africa, guess what? We don't have any agriculture. They went into the past to look for animal agriculture. So supposedly we lived there for almost 200,000 years, never invented it at all. We waited till we left Africa before we did the most basic thing of all. And then what we do is, I told you earlier about this human genome rapidly expanding at around 5,000 years ago. Well, guess what? We have other evidence for that as well. This chart shows you where haplogroups formed. Haplogroups are basically when a mutation arises in a population and reaches fixation in that population, then that population leaves an area. So for example, Native Americans have a haplogroup Q, and all Native Americans now have that mutation. So when you test a Native American in, say, a DNA test, and you find that mutation, you go, oh, it's just a Native American person. So look at exactly where the human population exploded from. Uh-oh, that's not Africa. What's going on here? Why in the world are all the massive amounts of haplogroups forming exactly where the Bible said they would form in? And where do we notice the spread going? Exactly around where the Bible says that Ham, Shem, and Japheth inherited their lands. And that's no coincidence. And when you go into Africa, you'll notice how few haplogroups there actually are. Very, very few for how many tribes there are living in different regions for over 200,000 years. Why aren't there more? There should be. I mean, they have more mutations, but that doesn't mean they're older. But the fact is, there's few of them. So that disagrees with what the Bible is showing. And they even admit Africa is just inferred to be the continent of origins for all humans. Largely obscure, owning to the complex heritage. Look, the African human population are the most genetically diverse in the world, meaning they have more mutations in them. That's why they think they're older. But inference about the African demography, history, evolution, and disease associated has been limited to relatively few genetic samples and scarce archaeological remains. Interesting how we didn't leave the archaeological remains of human history in the very continent we supposedly evolved in. Instead, we find the Middle East as like the literal Fertile Crescent area of the epicenter of all of these things. And like I said earlier, pyramids having the same math. Guess what else we find worldwide? We find this weird thing called the serpent. And the serpent is something that we find on different areas. That's a pagan symbol, but yet we find it on multiple continents in different places of the world with cultures that, again, supposedly never met one another. And the interesting thing about them is that they point to the summer solstice. Now, these are we've had a guy named Dan Biddle on, and he writes a book on the Nephilim, and he believes the Nephilim are what did this. And here's another pagan symbol that we find around the world in totally different locations from, again, people that supposedly never met one another, creating the exact same symbol of a pagan deity. Now, for the physical evidence, guess what? We actually have multiple pieces of physical evidence for the Tower of Babel, and guess about 4,000 years ago. But here we go. Alexander the Great, he ordered and intended to restore the temple. Back then it was called Bel Marduk, but he died before the work was actually complete. We know where this is today because in 330 BC, when he ordered the tower to be destroyed, the original one, he wanted to recreate a new version of it, but his untimely death never allowed it to happen. So all we have today is the base of it. But we actually have 3 pieces of other physical evidence besides just the base of it left today. Unfortunately, he destroyed the whole thing, but we do have pieces of it. And the interesting thing is the brick of bitumen talks about how the Bible actually made cement and they poured it and they made the tower out of that. Well, we actually have a brick of it to this day. So not only do we have a depiction of Nebuchadnezzar describing the tower itself, we also have another one with the ziggurat of the Tower of Babel, the city of Babel on it. We actually have the bricks that were actually made. They were baked clay as well. So very fascinating to have physical evidence for it.